Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 28 in the Gospel of Matthew. We're covering Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 43. This one's called the Kingdome Parables, part 1. In the first part of Matthew 13, Jesus shared a parable of 4 different soils and how those soils will affect the way the gospel is received. Once again, a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Some people erroneously think that a parable is just a fable or a fictional tale, but the parable shared by Jesus had eternal implications. Notice that in this chapter, Jesus does not explain the meaning of the parables to the multitude of people. Instead, the explanations by Jesus were of a private nature, specifically addressed to his disciples and to us. We will look at more of these kingdom parables today, and there will be some surprises. Some of these parables are not what they seem to be. Let's read our first passage today. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30 says this: "Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, An enemy has done this. The servant said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn." In the verses we will look at today, Jesus will share 3 additional kingdom parables with the multitude. And after sharing those 3 parables, the disciples will ask Jesus to explain the meaning of the parable of the tares and the wheat. We will address the explanation by Jesus of this parable in the order that it occurs in Matthew 13, after discussing 2 subsequent parables. In this first parable today, Jesus states that the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while he was sleeping, his enemy sowed tares among the wheat. Most people think of a tare as a simple weed, but that is not the case. Instead, these tares closely resemble wheat, but are toxic to humans. Likely, these plants are Zizania aquatica, prevalent in Israel. Some of the ill effects from ingesting Zizania are nausea, dizziness, speech and vision issues, and even coma in extreme circumstances. Zizania looks just like wheat, except it is a little blacker. The servants noticed first and commented that the owner must have purchased bad seed along with the good seed. But the owner knew the seed he had planted was good and that an enemy had intentionally done this to him. The servants assumed that the best way to deal with this was to instantly remove the tares. But the owner realized that it would be better to wait until the time of the harvest to address this problem, instead of uprooting the good wheat. At that time, the servants could bind the tares together into bundles and burn them, and separately harvest the wheat and put it into the owner's barn. Rather than guessing the meaning of this parable, we will hear the interpretation directly by Jesus after discussing 2 more parables. Let's read the next passage. Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 32 says this: "Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all the seeds. But when it is grown, it is greater than the herbs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches." In this parable, Jesus told the multitude that the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man sowed in his field. A mustard seed is smaller than other seeds, and in this parable, the plant grows to the size of a tree. In fact, this herb is so large that birds of the air nest in the branches of this mustard tree. Many people misinterpret this parable, in my opinion, thinking that it demonstrates the powerful nature of just a little bit of faith. That likely has to do with this verse from a subsequent passage in Matthew. Matthew chapter 17, verse 20 says this. So Jesus said to them, because of your unbelief, for assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. But there seems to be something else represented here. First of all, the mustard plant does not grow into a tree ever. Instead, it is a bush, about 3 feet high at the largest. During springtime in Israel, the yellow flowers of these mustard plants permeate the hillsides. Another key to the interpretation of this verse is that the birds are similar to those in the first parable that we discussed yesterday. Remember, Jesus explained that when the seed was sown by the wayside and was eaten by the birds, that the birds were symbolic of the devil. That seems to be the same symbolism used in this parable as well. Instead of a mustard plant that should be the size of a bush, it has grown to the size of an immense tree, out of control, too big for its own good. In fact, that tree is so large that the birds feel secure within that tree. I don't think I've ever seen a bird's nest in a 3-foot-high bush, just not secure enough. Most Bible teachers think that this parable points to the amazing way that the church would grow from a small amount of faith to a worldwide church. It could just as easily point to the church growing to something it was not intended to be. Mega churches come to mind. I'm not a fan. My best experiences in churches have been in much smaller churches. When I picture the church displayed in the book of Acts, it sounds like believers really cared for the needs of their fellow believers. In order to do this, a church needs to be at a conducive size to be familiar with the members of that church family, where the people in the church are not just numbers or faces, but are our family members. The perfect size of a church, in my opinion, is one in which we can look in the person's face, that same person we have fellowshiped with often, and see in their face if they are hurting. It is much easier to edify that person, to come alongside that person in intercessory prayer or other helpful ways. The opposite of this is the megachurch, where we rarely would see the same person twice. In addition, megachurches are more of a show than a family dinner. Personally, based on the tree-like size of the mustard plant and the birds in the tree, which are a symbol of the devil, I think this parable is pointing to that oversized representation of the church that was not intended. But this is simply my opinion, and that opinion could come from my anti-megachurch prejudice. Maybe it does point to something very small that turns into something very large. But then what do the birds symbolize? Let's read our next parable. Matthew chapter 13, verse 33 says this. Another parable he spoke to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was all leavened. This parable is the shortest of all, and though seemingly simple, this parable is also more than it appears to be on the surface. First of all, notice the audience. Jesus the rabbi is speaking to Jewish people in the multitude. But is this parable really addressed to the Jews? Most of us are aware of the symbolic nature of leaven in the Bible. Leaven is a symbol of sin, In the same way that leaven puffs up bread, sin puffs up man. This symbol points to pride. It is one thing to put leaven into dough, knowing that it will cause the bread to rise. But why did this woman hide the leaven into the 3 measures of meal in the bread? Was she in a hurry? Did she not think her guests would notice the difference between leavened bread and unleavened bread? And why were there 3 measures? Let's look at a verse in the Old Testament that gives us an example of bread baked with 3 measures of meal. Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 10 says this: Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground, and said, My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, and I will bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. They said, Do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, Quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Then they said to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? So he said, Here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. This certainly appears to be a Christophany, an Old Testament appearance of Jesus. After the resurrection of Jesus, we see Jesus preparing breakfast for his disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Here we see Sarah making a meal for Jesus and 2 angels on their way to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. This makes me think of a chef preparing a meal for a celebrity and desperately not wanting to mess that meal up. I wonder if Sarah was nervous cooking for Jesus. But this is another example of Jesus eating a meal. I hope this means we will be eating meals in heaven. Likely it was not because he needed the sustenance. This is a simple meal in the Jewish culture. Bread with 3 measures of meal is referred to as the fellowship offering. But let's notice a few other things present in this Old Testament passage. Jews today still practice kosher dietary restrictions. Part of being kosher involves the cleanliness of the food, but at the same time, there also are limitations on what Jews can and cannot eat. For example, they cannot eat pork or shellfish. Another one of those limitations is that they cannot eat meat and dairy on the same day. Based on a possibly incorrect interpretation of this verse from Exodus 23, verse 19. The first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. It has been suggested that instead, this verse explains the cruelty of eating both the animal and its baby. Others state that it was an ancient custom of the heathens to boil a baby goat in its mother's milk in order to make gardens and fields more bountiful. Regardless of its meaning, look what Sarah makes. 3 leavened cakes of bread, some milk and butter, and beef. This is certainly not a kosher meal, as it mixes dairy with meat. Back to our parable, what is different about this fellowship offering? Notice that with the 3 measures of meal, the woman adds leaven. Once again, leaven points to sin. In addition, this is the only parable of the ones Jesus shares in Matthew 13 that refers to a woman. One possible explanation of this parable is that it symbolizes how the gospel message would transform all of the world, spreading to the four corners of the earth. The dough reacts to the leaven. We cannot see that reaction as it occurs, but we can see the effects. And just as the leaven changes the dough inside and out, our lives as believers also are changed inside and out. The gospel spreads by people sharing that message with others, and just a little leaven from us can bring someone else to the Lord. I think that the leaven in this parable points to the Gentiles rather than the Jews. Now we get to one of the most interesting passages in this chapter. Matthew chapter 13, verses 34 through 35 says this: "All these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things kept secret from the foundations of the world." This demonstrates a major change in the ministry of Jesus. Previously, the Pharisees attributed the work of Jesus and the works of the Holy Spirit to Satan. Jesus knew they were trying to trip him up, and from that point forward, from Matthew 13 on, when Jesus spoke in public, he only spoke in parables. Again, he still spoke to his disciples in private, as we will see, as he explains the meaning of some of these parables. But to the multitudes listening to Jesus, they only heard words in parables. It might be that some of those people actually understood the parables, but it is likely there were very few to understand those public words of Jesus from this point onward. If we understand these parables, it is because the Holy Spirit has revealed the meaning to us. It's not because we're smarter than others. Instead, the Holy Spirit can use teachers to open our minds to understand the mysteries of heaven. Many of the words of Jesus are mysteries that he reveals to us. And notice that these kingdom parables were not shared in the Old Testament. They are specific to the New Testament, just as the mystery of the church is revealed in the New Testament. Remember, only the sheep know the shepherd's voice. Only the sheep hear the shepherd's voice. Let's read our last passage today. Matthew chapter 13, verses 36 through 43 says this: "Then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, 'Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field.' He answered and said to them, 'He who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Fortunately for us, the disciples asked Jesus to explain the parables of the tares and the wheat. Notice that the explanation from Jesus is private. The explanation was not spoken to the multitude, but instead only to his disciples. In this parable, Jesus tells them that the one sowing the good seed is the Son of Man, who is Jesus. The field represents the world, and we can remember that the owner of the field sowed good seed, while the enemy of the owner sowed bad seed. The good seed are the sons of the kingdom of heaven, believers. At the same time, the tares that came from the bad seed are the sons of the wicked one. Obviously, the wicked one is the devil. Angels will harvest these souls, and this will occur at the end of the ages. Obviously, this does not point to the rapture, as both believers and unbelievers will be included in this process. At the rapture, only believers will be removed. At the end of this age, unbelievers will be cast into the furnace of fire, and fire is always symbolic of judgment. This is the lake of fire and brimstone, and as we have seen in many other verses, the people sent there will be wailing and gnashing their teeth. The righteous will live in the kingdom of their Father. To conclude this passage, we see this interesting statement, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Having just studied the book of Revelation, we should be familiar with this phrase. In the 7 letters from Jesus to 7 different churches, at the end of each of those letters, we see this same phrase. Most of us are familiar with the heptatic structure of John, which occurs frequently in both the Gospel of John and in the book of Revelation. This phrase appears 7 times in the book of Revelation and 7 other times in the New Testament, including here in Matthew 13. Some Bible scholars have drawn a comparison between the letters of Jesus to the churches and the 7 kingdom parables of Matthew 13. In the same manner that the letters to the churches in Revelation can be applied in order to the churches to church history, these parables seemingly can also be applied to those 7 churches of Revelation in order. For example, this kingdom parable concerning the tares and the wheat can be applied to the church of Smyrna, which was the persecuted church in church history. The kingdom parable of the mustard seed seems to connect to the church of Pergamos, and in church history, to the church that was married to the world. And finally, the kingdom parable of the woman and the leaven can be applied to Thyatira and the church in the medieval ages. Obviously, there are many levels in the Bible. We can read it and benefit from it on a surface level, and at the same time, the Bible has more depth than we can ever imagine. Each of these parables are vastly important in our walks with the Lord and can be applied personally to ourselves in our private walks with Jesus, and in addition, can be applied to an individual church, a denomination, and even Christianity as a whole. This is a very important chapter, and each of us could spend many hours reflecting on the lessons herein. We will see more important messages as we finish this chapter tomorrow. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.